This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 254. Was Sherlock Holmes crazy? Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you crazy?
Yes. Yes, and I've got the certifications and also the straitjacket to prove it. You know, in fact, over the years, I've been given a number of straitjackets. I had one when I was just in middle school. It was very attractive. Velcro, had lions and a lot of Disney characters on it. And then as I've aged, you know, I've gone through the preppy style and the other style. I had a bell-bottom straitjacket for a while.
I'm sure you did. You got to roll with the times.
And now that
right?
I'm older, I've got the formal straitjacket.
There you go.
With the white belt.
Well, maybe to go with the white shoes. Well, maybe
yes.
We should come out with a tweed version, the Sherlock Holmes brand straitjacket.
Harris tweed, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Well, folks, you are probably ready to put yourselves in a straitjacket as we do this, but let's get right to the program. Just a reminder, the show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles254. That'll take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site where you can click on any links that are related to what we're discussing here. And of course, feel free to leave us a rating or review or simply share the show with somebody you know. The more Sherlockians we can bring to this show and understand some of the details behind the stories, the better off I think we all are. All right. Well, we are kind of speaking in the vernacular here with Sherlock Holmes crazy, but we're actually talking about a medical diagnosis. This comes to us. It was inspired by an article, a paper that Gideon Hill did. That is part of the illustrious client's sixth case book called 70 Years by Gaslamp. The specific article is called The Lithium Link, Mania, Gout, and Sherlock Holmes. Now, Burt, that seems like an unusual assembly of topics. How do we get from mania to gout to Sherlock Holmes?
It is unusual, but it's a lot of fun, and it's worth underscoring to our listeners that this is one of the joys of the science societies. You know, people talk a lot about the Baker Street Irregulars, but there are hundreds, certainly more than 100 of these societies in the United States. I forget the exact number, but they publish, and the illustrious clients is one of these scion societies, and this is their sixth casebook, and their publications go back, you know, I think certainly to the 1950s, if not to the 1940s. And these papers are really interesting. And Gideon Hill is a Sherlockian that we've not seen much of in the last few years. We should point out that he is Dr. Gideon Hill, MD. And what he did in this particular paper, which was presented at the Christmas party, I believe, at the Christmas gathering of the illustrious clients back in 2009. Is that right? He applied some principles. Yes, for the Christmas meeting 2009, he applied some principles in diagnosis. And he pointed out of course, that a physical examination is really required to do any reasonable diagnosis, as well as a patient evaluation based on modern psychiatry's tool, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Medical Disorders, which I'm sure there's a chapter for me in there, the DSM. And that uses specific behaviors as diagnostic criteria. So as we can't actually put our hands on Sherlock Holmes, said Gideon, we should look at the details Watson included in the canon and see what we can do by way of straightforward deductive reasoning.
Yeah. And if we want to go by the DSM, some of the things that they use as indicators for what used to be known as manic depressive disorders, now known as bipolar disorder. Some of these symptoms include racing thoughts, little need for sleep, excess pursuit of goal-directed activities, tendency to engage in activities with a high risk of danger, and an episode of depression. That was the manic side. Episodes of depression may be marked by disordered sleep, insomnia or hypersomnia, low energy or fatigue, and feelings of hopelessness. And Gideon very correctly asserts that there are periods in the Sherlock Holmes stories in the canon that are filled with these kinds of instances. I mean, right out of the gate when we meet Sherlock Holmes in A Study in Scarlet, he admits to Dr. Watson that he can be the laziest devil in shoe leather, and he may lounge around for days on end, but just leave him alone and he'll soon be right. Right? Almost a self-aware diagnosis that he knows he goes through these depressive states, but he can snap out of it.
Very true. And we should also remind our listeners, if they don't know, that just stepping out of the Sherlock Holmes world for a microsecond, Arthur Conan Doyle, one of his early professional experiences was with a Dr. Budd, Dr. George Budd, I think that was his name. And this is written up in another work by Conan Doyle. And Budd was a character like this, highly manic, given to grandiose gestures, a very extreme individual. And clearly some of these behaviors stayed with Conan Doyle. And of course, with Back to Holmes, this kind of behavior is consistent throughout the canon. In the Red-Headed League is an example, or the Musgrave Ritual. Watson tells us these outbursts of passionate energy were followed by reactions of lethargy, during which he would lie about, hardly moving, say, from the sofa to the table. And of course, you've got the famous episode of Holmes with his hair trigger and 100 boxer cartridges proceeding to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic VR. He has this gunplay inside Baker Street. So this is unusual to say the least.
Yeah, I could imagine if Holmes wished to put marks in the wall when he was in more of a depressive state, he would have used, darts instead?
Yeah, that's true. Well, that's only if you're looking to have somebody buy the next pint for you, yeah.
Well, I mean, those are great instances. And of course, we have a couple of instances of Holmes doing some recuperation as well after what ostensibly would have been some of these manic phases. He's taking a holiday in Cornwall, of course, very famously, in The Devil's Foot. The specialist, Dr. Moore Agar, recommended that he have some R&R and get away from it all. Similarly, in the opening of the Reigate Squires, we find that Holmes is in a country house, again, kind of relaxing. It was after he came back from France, I think, and was knee-deep or ankle-deep in telegrams, congratulatory telegrams. I think we talked about on our telegram episode, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, Gideon's exploration here sort of ends, the first part of this ends with the conclusion that Holmes perhaps exhibited two peaks of what one might call bipolar behavior. The first was in 1881, the year Holmes and Watson first met at St. Bartholomew's, and the second was after Holmes's return from the Great Hiatus in 1895. And then Gideon takes us into a little journey to explore whether or not, on top of this particular condition, Holmes also had gout.
Now, wait a minute. That seems like a bit of a jump to me from bipolar disorder to gout. How do we get there? You know what? Well, don't answer that, Bert, because we have to take this quick break from our sponsor. We'll find out right after this quick word. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today. All right, we're back. And Bert, are you ready to reveal that secret? The second instance.
The second instance. Well, what Gideon tells us is that there are reasons to assume, or to come to the conclusion rather than to assume, that a therapeutic intervention for another disease state impacted the course of Holmes's mental illness. And that disease state, he suggests, is gout. And the link between those two conditions is lithium, because lithium was also a standard treatment for gout in the 19th century. As well, Gideon said in 2009, the modern treatment of choice for bipolar disorder. Now, I don't know that that's still true, but I don't know that it's not. And he points out, the reasons for this, the advocation of lithium for the disorder of gout in a variety of textbooks and so on. And Gideon suggests Watson was no doubt familiar with these publications. And, of course, Watson was a trained man of medicine.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I can't say I ever remember Sherlock Holmes being associated with or mentioned in connection with gout. The one thing I do remember in the canon about gout is it Dr. Leslie Armstrong? Is he the one? Or is it, no, Lord Mount James? It's from the Missing 3/4. He was said to be able to, he could chalk his billiard cue with his knuckles because he was so crammed full of gout. That's the only mention of gout I remember in the canon. So how is it that we get that Sherlock Holmes was on lithium to treat gout and therefore had his bipolar disorder under control?
Well, the inductive reasoning that Gideon suggests, first of all, around gout, is Holmes' fondness for Turkish baths. And that Gideon suggests is often used as a remedy to address the symptoms of certain joint conditions. Gideon suggests it was a common part of their routine. And in Lady Frances Carfax, Watson states that he went to a Turkish bath because he felt rheumatic, which specifically links the practice to symptoms of the joints. Now, that doesn't necessarily say anything about Holmes, of course, but all of these examples, Gideon admits, don't allow for a definitive diagnosis of gout. But when you look at Holmes's medical condition, Gideon observes that his manic depressive course was highly unusual because the condition is lifelong, incurable, and without treatment, and invariably, he says, would progress to dangerous or violent behavior. And with treatment, Gideon says, the patient lives a relatively normal life. Well, Holmes's mental condition followed a more benign course, says Gideon. And so we've already mentioned the two periods in which that was manifest. So Gideon uses all that to come to the conclusion a therapeutic intervention for another disease state, gout, impacted the course of his mental illness. And I think that, that's really clever.
That is really clever. When we think about Holmes in retirement, he was said to be riddled with rheumatism, which, again, is kind of a non-specific diagnosis, also affecting the joints. What we've got here with the incidence of gout and bipolar disorder is kind of a brake and a gas pedal, and receiving medication for one would actually accidentally treat the other. And, you think about the risky behaviors that Holmes had. The hiatus was certainly filled with some of those. I mean, venturing into Mecca like Sir Richard Burton did, it was an extremely dangerous practice as an Anglo-Saxon. Climbing the face of the Reichenbach Falls alone and taking on Professor Moriarty was a highly risky activity, as were a number of the other things that he did over the course of the hiatus there. So, you're seeing these behaviors manifested, and you're seeing Holmes, working his way through them. Obviously, he couldn't be on medication while he was on the road, at least not from a prescribed type. And look, I think it's no curiosity or no coincidence, I should say, that Holmes, when he was particularly in his depressive states, was self-medicating with cocaine.
Yes.
We see this kind of activity with people that have disorders like ADD and other anxiety disorders. They tend to self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, etc. It's almost the body's way of craving what it needs to actually right itself.
Indeed. Yeah, very well said. Well, Gideon takes us home with, a conclusion in his lovely paper that centers very appropriately on Watson and Watson's value to Sherlock Holmes and his value to someone like Holmes, who may have had such a mental condition as he is postulating for Sherlock Holmes. And he refers, of course, to what you've already mentioned, which is Dr. Moore Agar's advice that Holmes open himself to a complete rest that's around the trip to Cornwall, recorded in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. But, Gideon points out that Watson's role, was really essential to Holmes' survival. During Watson's lifetime, medicine, says Gideon, had few effective treatments for disease. All of the interventions we're familiar with came along in the 20th century, particularly including systematic and rigorous drug testing and discovery. But, during his long association with Holmes, when the hallmark of the medical profession was careful clinical observation, could Watson have failed to notice that lithium prescribed for the gout controlled Holmes' manic behavior? Surely he noted both the interplay of these two conditions and the curative link that lithium provided. Well, had Watson published his clinical observations, he would be, says Gideon, at the pinnacle of medical history today. He could have described bipolar disorder decades before it was, and also discovered its definitive treatment.
Yeah, how about that? Watson sacrificing his career on behalf of Holmes. Well, I have to imagine that the fame and the money that Watson was getting from publishing in the Strand magazine, and the fact that we are still speaking his name today, was worth far more than being at the top of his profession for a few years.
All of his fame and wealth and innumerable honors next to the joy of Sherlock Holmes is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Mrs. Hudson! Mrs. Hudson!